My first week as a night auditor at the hotel was uneventful. I won't lie, the overnight shift can be a bit lonely, but the hotel was so beautiful and well organized that I felt safe. The reception area was warmly lit, and I kept busy checking reservations and reviewing reports. Everything seemed normal. However, on the fourth night, I noticed something different. The lights in one of the hallways started flickering, specifically in the oldest wing of the building. I thought it was some electrical issue and made a note to inform maintenance the next day. But when I went to check it out, I felt a strange chill as I stepped into that hallway. It was as if the air there was heavier. I tried to shake it off and returned to my desk. The next night, everything was quiet until around 2 a.m. when I heard the sound of a door slamming. It was strange, as I was certain there were no guests on that particular floor. I grabbed the master key and went to check, but I didn't find anyone. Some doors were open, which made no sense, as I had personally ensured everything was locked earlier in my shift. While closing one of the doors, I felt as though someone was watching me. I looked around but saw nothing. Still, the unsettling feeling of being observed stayed with me for the rest of the night. That intense chill made my skin crawl, but what I found inside the storage room convinced me something was very wrong. In the corner of the room, a pile of papers was scattered on a table, but one yellowed newspaper page caught my attention. It was torn, as if someone had tried to hide it, and the date revealed it was from many years ago. As I began to read, my heart raced. The newspaper reported a tragic accident during the hotel's construction. A scaffolding had collapsed, killing several workers. Construction was temporarily halted, but apparently the deaths were never properly investigated, and the hotel was completed without delay. That newspaper page chilled me to the bone, as if a piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. I knew something was wrong with the building, but now I was convinced the hotel wasn't just haunted. It was a prison for the spirits of the workers who had died there. The ghostly figures, the flickering lights, the footsteps in the corridors. It all made sense now. The hotel was steeped in pain and anger, and it seemed like the spirits were trying to warn someone, me, and apparently I was the only person who could see it. I couldn't stop thinking about those workers and the tragedy that had unfolded there. The building, now a luxury landmark in the city, hid a dark past, and the spirits of those lost souls seemed desperate to communicate something. I returned to the lobby, feeling a weight on my chest, as though invisible eyes were watching me. Every shadow seemed to shift on its own, and the creaks of the walls echoed in my mind. That's when I realized the strange events weren't happening by chance. They wanted me to know something. Suddenly, the eerie figure I had seen in the hallways appeared again. Clearer this time, closer, as if it had been waiting for me. Its eyes were hollow, but its gestures were filled with a desperation I couldn't understand. Like a human-shaped shadow, it pointed toward the staircase leading to the upper floor where I knew more records were stored. I knew I had to follow, but a paralyzing fear gripped me. I didn't know what else I might find there, but somehow, deep down, I knew I had to go. And maybe, if I didn't, whatever was haunting the hotel would never leave me alone. I climbed the stairs with my heart pounding, my footsteps echoing in the deadly silence of the hotel. With each step, the air grew heavier, as if something was closing in around me. I reached the door to the records room, and before opening it, I heard a faint but distinct sound, like someone whispering my name. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the panic that was starting to consume me. There was no turning back now. When I entered the room, the feeling of being watched intensified. The lights flickered intermittently, illuminating piles of dusty documents. I moved slowly between the shelves until a yellowed page caught my attention. It was a newspaper clipping about the accident. It spoke of scaffolding collapsing during the hotel's construction, killing several workers. The article mentioned a series of subsequent accidents at the site, but the strangest detail was that, after the tragedy, many involved in the project claimed to hear noises and see strange figures in the hallways. Something inside me froze. I already knew, but now I was certain. The workers' spirits were still here, trying to warn someone about something else, something still hidden. I couldn't take my eyes off the page. The yellowed paper seemed to glow oddly under the flickering light. The silence in the room was so thick I could hear the sound of my ragged breathing and my racing heartbeat. I was about to turn the pages of the file to find more when suddenly a chill ran down my spine. Movement in the hallway made my body freeze instantly. Something was there. It wasn't my imagination. I could feel it, as though a presence was watching me. I went to the door, and as I cracked it open, the ghostly figure appeared again, clearer than ever. It was closer now, approaching steadily, floating slowly down the corridor. Its face was pale, and its hollow eyes stared directly at me. The figure seemed to want to warn me, but its words were blocked by an overwhelming sense of terror. The air grew denser, as if the space was being consumed by a cold, oppressive energy. The hotel, that luxurious building, was overrun by the spirits of the workers, and somehow I was next. I had uncovered the secret, and now I knew I couldn't leave without confronting whatever was lurking in the shadows. I could no longer ignore the growing feeling that the place was consuming everything I was. With each passing day, I felt more suffocated, more trapped in that cycle of inexplicable and disturbing events. I knew that the longer I stayed there, the more the spirits of those workers would haunt me. What I saw and felt were not hallucinations. They weren't just ghost stories. It was real. They were there, and they wouldn't leave me alone. That night, after seeing the figure in the hallway once again, a wave of desperation washed over me. I knew I couldn't stay at that hotel any longer. I couldn't risk another night. I got up from my chair and went straight to the manager's office. I didn't look back, as if some invisible force was pulling me away from that place. Once there, without overthinking, I resigned on the spot. I explained quickly, without many details, and I could hear the surprise in the manager's tone, who likely thought I was crazy. But what I had seen, what I felt, wasn't something that could be easily explained. I left the hotel that night without looking back, without wanting to understand anything more about that evil. I grabbed my backpack, packed my things into my car, and drove far away. The hotel disappeared behind me, but the feeling of being watched, of something following me, never truly left. One thing I knew for certain: I wasn't going to wait to become another victim of those tormented souls. I had to leave before it was too late. I don't really know what happened, but I'll try to explain. After my relationship ended, I needed time alone, so I decided to take a trip to get away from everything. I was heading to more isolated places, so when I arrived at that motel, I didn't think much of it. It seemed cheap, but quiet. The owner was a bit odd, an older man with a distant expression, but nothing too unusual. I got the room key and went to my quarters. Everything was simple and worn down, but nothing alarming. As the night fell, however, I started noticing strange things, like something was off. The atmosphere seemed to change subtly but uncomfortably. That's when I saw the strange man, the same one who had given me the key. He was standing in the hallway with a disoriented look. When he saw me, he approached quickly, as if in a hurry. He said, almost whispering, "You need to leave before it gets dark. You're not safe here." I was unsettled by the situation, but thought it might just be his age, something imagined. I tried to relax and ignored it, but as the night progressed, the noises started. At first, it was subtle, like someone walking in the rooms next door, but somehow the sound felt heavier than it should. The kind of noise that bothers you, yet you convince yourself it's just an old building, but it became harder and harder to ignore. The real trouble began when I tried to sleep. Every noise in the hallway woke me, and I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. The unease grew by the minute, like the place was slowly consuming me. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion, that I was overthinking, but it wasn't normal. Then I started hearing whispers coming from the hallway. They weren't clear sounds, more like muffled murmurs, as if someone was speaking softly, but I couldn't see anyone. I got up several times to check the hallway, but there was no one. The place was silent, except for my footsteps and the growing sense of being watched. I decided to leave my room and walk around the motel to clear my head. But the more I walked, the more the place seemed to grow larger and more confusing. I passed the same spot several times, like I was trapped in an endless loop. The motel looked the same, but somehow felt different, as if it had changed without me noticing. When I finally found the exit door, my relief lasted only seconds. When I grabbed the doorknob, it wouldn't open. I tried several times, but it wouldn't budge. Panic started to set in. I turned back and went to the reception desk, hoping the strange man would be there to help, but the receptionist was gone. Instead, a heavy silence filled the space, and that's when I began to notice something that chilled me to the core. The place seemed frozen in time. The air felt dense, like something terrible was about to happen. I was really starting to feel desperate. Every step I took felt more erratic, aimless. The motel was quiet, but the silence was oppressive, like the place was waiting for something. I returned to the reception desk, but the door was locked. The receptionist wasn't there, nor was anyone else. That's when the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. I was alone, yet I felt as if someone, or something, was around me, observing. I tried not to let fear take over, but it was nearly impossible. As I walked through the corridors, I noticed the doors to the rooms were partially open, but there were no lights on. The place was empty, yet the doors were ajar, as if everyone had simply vanished. I tried the main door again, pulling hard, and while the handle seemed to give slightly, it wouldn't open. I went to one of the windows and looked outside. All I could see was the deserted road, the motel surrounded by nothing but darkness. I stood there for a while, hoping something would change, but nothing did. The claustrophobia only grew. Everything was so still, so empty, it felt like a horror movie, but I knew it was real. I went to the kitchen, which was empty too. There were dirty plates with old food, a mess of utensils and scattered glasses. I searched for some clue, anything to explain what was happening, but everything seemed out of place, as if time had stopped there. I was no longer in control of the situation. I started running through the corridors, back and forth, trying to find some exit, some answer. The more I searched, the more it felt like the motel was pulling me away from anything familiar, making me feel lost and alone. Fear turned into panic. I wanted to find a logical explanation, but all I had was the sense that something was deeply wrong and I needed to get out. The feeling of dread only grew as I walked down that endless hallway. I started to feel nauseous, something I'd never felt before. It was as if the environment was affecting me physically. My head throbbed with a pulsating pain that worsened with each step. I tried leaning against the wall, but it didn't help. My vision blurred, and the sensation that the place was consuming me made me feel weaker by the second. My steps slowed, as if the air was getting denser, heavier. The headache was unbearable, and the nausea only got worse. I felt on the verge of passing out, my vision dimming as the space around me seemed to distort. I stopped for a moment and tried to calm down, breathing deeply, but the fear and pain were too intense. The sense of being trapped in that place began to take over. The motel, which had seemed like a simple stopover, now felt like a prison, and I didn't know how to escape. The floor was cold beneath my feet, and my breathing was rapid and shallow. I couldn't tell if the pain was in my mind or if the place was somehow physically affecting me. My head was spinning, and all I wanted was to find a way out, to escape this growing unease. Gathering what little strength I had left, I grabbed the key to my room and dragged myself back there. I knew I shouldn't stay in that place any longer, but what else could I do? When I reached the room, I collapsed onto the bed, too weak to do anything else. The nausea was making me dizzy, and the headache wouldn't let up. I stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't leave me. For a moment, I thought about just sleeping, letting it all go, and trying not to think anymore. But the fear that something was watching me wouldn't let me rest. Something was off, and I knew I couldn't stop until I figured out what it was. I couldn't endure that unease any longer. With trembling hands, I took a dose of the medication I always carried for severe headaches and tried to calm down. The nausea lingered, but at least the headache started to subside little by little. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would take over and allow me to escape the disorienting feeling consuming me. When I finally fell asleep, it felt as though everything that had happened in the past few hours was a nightmare. My sleep was deep and dreamless, like being engulfed by endless darkness. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was softly illuminating the room. I was disoriented, but the headache was gone, and so was the nausea. The sense that something was wrong had vanished as if it had never existed. I stayed in bed for a few minutes, feeling an odd sense of relief. Yet, something still bothered me. I knew something had happened the previous night, but the clarity I'd hoped for was fading with time, as though it had all been a fleeting nightmare. I got out of bed and started packing up to leave the motel. The place still looked run down, but now it seemed ordinary, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. There were no more signs of danger, no strange sensations, and no unusual noises. The atmosphere was quiet, too quiet. I went to the reception desk to check out, but the man there didn't seem to notice my discomfort. He simply handed me the bill with a forced smile, as if everything was normal. I, on the other hand, felt an unbearable urgency to leave, as if just being there was more than I could bear. I grabbed my bag and walked out of the motel, taking a deep breath as the fresh air hit me. The place now seemed even gloomier than it had when I arrived, but I didn't care anymore. Whatever had happened that night seemed beyond explanation. All I knew was that at that moment, I was grateful to be leaving. As I drove away, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some sort of physical reaction, an illness affecting my mind, and that the visions and sounds were nothing but stress-induced hallucinations. But deep down, there was a persistent feeling that I should never have stopped there in the first place.